Hi, everyone, and welcome to Attentive Healthcare Solutions webinar, Understanding the Bad Debt Process from Start to Finish. My name is Chelsea Grover, and I'm the Marketing Communications Coordinator for Attentive. Before we dive into today's webinar, I wanted to take a minute to explain the process for the presentation. First, I'd like to mention that this webinar will be recorded. We'll send out a copy along with the slides of the recording within the next week. Next, for those of you who aren't familiar with Attentive, I wanted to share a bit of who we are with you. We specialize specifically in NextGen healthcare, and we're passionate about providing solutions for our healthcare provider partners, which in turn help them to improve patient care, enhance the patient experience, and maintain a financially healthy practice. To sum it up, we do everything NextGen. And we also have some NextGen add-on productivity solutions, including ChartGuard and Refund Manager. Next, I wanted to mention an upcoming webinar that we're planning on doing in December on how to make your NextGen workflow more efficient with defaults and favorites. We're still getting the details worked out on that, but it's sure to be a popular one, so keep your eyes out for the invitation next month. Okay, so back to today's webinar on understanding the bad debt process from start to finish. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor up to questions from you. We'll answer all the questions at the end, but you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel whenever they occur to you. And finally, for audio clarity purposes, everyone's phone will remain muted throughout the entire webinar. If you experience audio issues, please use the chat box to let us know so we can resolve them. And again, questions may be entered in the questions box. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Lindsay Lanning is Manager of Client Development, and Lexi DeMarche is Manager of Consultant Development at Attentive. So Lindsay, the webinar's all yours. Feel free to take it away when you're ready.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you, Chelsea. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar, Understanding the Bad Debt Process from Start to Finish. I see a lot of new faces, or I guess names, I should say, since I can't see any of you, as well as a lot of our veteran webinar attendees as well. So welcome, everyone. If we were able to connect with you at UGM in Orlando last week, I'm so glad you could join us again today. And hopefully we are all recovered from UGM and didn't catch a cold on the plane ride back like me. So if my voice goes out or I happen to sniffle, I apologize in advance. Took enough Dayquil today, we should be good. Now, I'm sure some of you got this invite and wondered, why are we doing a webinar on such a specific topic? And then hopefully, since you're on this call, your second thought was, what a great idea. Why we chose this topic is because if your practice is like most we've talked to or we've worked with, there's a good chance that you may have thousands or hundreds of dollars of unpaid patient payments. For this reason, we wanted to offer education on the bad debt process, which includes steps your practice can take to recover this potentially lost revenue. In NextGen, the bad debt process allows you to actually move the encounter to a bad debt status, send it to collections, and most importantly, settle the unpaid balance. This process has the potential to increase your practice revenue by not letting unpaid patient payments go unchecked or uncollected. So today we're going to be going through the entire bad debt process from start to finish in NextGen Enterprise PM, including step-by-step instructions on how to pre-list encounters and then send them to bad debt. We're doing this because our ultimate goal here is for you to maintain a financially healthy practice to continue providing high-quality care to your patients. But first, you know me, we couldn't resist giving you some background and industry information on why this is so important before we just jump right into the NextGen side of things. So right now, practices are being tasked with staying afloat amidst ever-changing reimbursement. I mean, there are constant legislative changes to reimbursement for providers through Macra and new E&M coding and reimbursement guidelines and so much more. As a result, in order to maintain a successful physician practice, providers all over the country are being forced to get pretty creative with how to earn and maintain revenue because, as we're about to see, reimbursement is not keeping up with inflation. If you don't believe me, let's look at this chart from healthaffairs.org. It shows from 2001 to 2014, general inflation increased 33.4%, and physician practice expenses increased 60.6%. And to make matters even worse, Medicare payment rates only went up 2.9%. I mean, look at the reality of the difference between that red line of what it costs to run a practice compared to that green line of Medicare payments, which 5 years later, that gap is probably even larger by now. Now, Something big did happen right after 2014 that impacted provider reimbursement, and that was the Medicare Access and CHIP Reauthorization Act of 2015, which we lovingly call Macra. Now, Macra intended to stabilize physician payment rates in the Medicare fee-for-service realm and incentivize physicians to move into value-based payment models. So the legislation essentially provided 5 years of small annual increases in payment rates, followed by no change for 5 years. Prior to the passing of Macra, payment increases for Medicare services were set by the Sustainable Growth Rate, or the SGR. The SGR capped spending increases according to the growth in the Medicare population and allowed a modest amount for inflation. However, as clinicians increased their utilization of these services, the reimbursement for each unit of service had to be adjusted downward in some way, essentially to hold that cost constant. So in practice, the SGR would have resulted in large decreases in the physician fee schedule, which just wasn't sustainable. To avoid these decreases in reimbursement, Congress had to pass a new law essentially every year, authorizing the current fee schedule and a small increase for inflation. So I think we all remember the days of Congress passing temporary doc fix bills to avert cuts in reimbursements. They were always extremely large headlines. Everyone was always really nervous around them and when they would be released. In fact, I can still remember the headlines that if Macra did not repeal the SGR in 2015, there would have been a 21% cut in Medicare payments to clinicians. So when they said Macra provided a small increase for inflation, they really meant small increase, if any. Medicare, for as long as I can remember, decades now, has used a complex formula to determine physician reimbursement. So for any given service, the relative value units, or RVUs, assigned to that service are multiplied by a dollar amount, and that's referred to as the conversion factor. So as you can see from this graph, the conversion factor has not kept up anywhere near inflation amounts. So the conversion factor used to determine payment for physicians in 2019 is $36.04. That's slightly lower than what it was in 1998. In 1998, it was actually $36.69. So while the conversion factor has remained relatively flat for the last 20 plus years, general inflation has risen more than 50% in that same time period. If the conversion factor had been indexed for general inflation, that's not even considering an additional medical inflation, starting in 1998, its current value would actually be $57.60. So what we can gather from this is pretty simple. Under Macra's revised methodology for updating the fee-for-service schedule, fee-for-service payments are not keeping up with inflation or the cost of running a practice, bottom line. So how are physician offices expected to stay in business with that level of reimbursement? Well, the passing of Macra made it pretty clear CMS was focused on shifting payments from volume to value. Macra did away with the SGR and scheduled a statutory increase of 0.5% to the physician fee schedule each year from 2016 to 2020. CMS's main goal with Macra is to reward high value and high quality clinicians, and at the same time, reduce payments to those clinicians who aren't meeting performance standards. But there's a catch. Although the fee-for-service schedule was scheduled to increase by 0.5% each year from 2016 to 2020, the budget neutrality requirement of Macra means it was actually unable to raise it to that amount. So this table shows the actual change over the past 4 years. So you can see where that 0.5% turned into roughly 0.2 or 0.3 or even 0.1%. And CMS has just finalized about 2 weeks ago a 0.14% increase in 2020 across the board fee-for-service payment rates. And that, again, is effective January 1st, 2020. So now that that 2020 physician fee schedule rate has been passed at only 5 cents more than the 2019 rate, the question of how physicians earn additional reimbursement remains. So to put it in perspective, according to MGM Poll that was actually taken in January of this year, currently more than 2/3 or 67%, almost 70% of medical practices report that 2019 Medicare payments will not cover the cost of delivering care to Medicare beneficiaries. So what are practices relying on to cover and offset this shortfall? And looking beyond 2020, Macra ruled that that physician fee schedule is going to enter a 6-year period of 0% updates. So you can see in that table, any increases in reimbursement will now be strictly based off value-based care incentives. So kind of a running joke at UGM kept saying was, we've been saying value-based care is coming for years and years now. And I think especially with the start of 2020, value-based care is here. And let's also not forget, just this month, CMS actually finalized a major change to the E&M coding. So although these changes don't go into effect until January 1st, 2021, this will also have a major impact on physician reimbursement. And keep in mind, the finalized E&M coding rule is actually completely different than the E&M proposed changes that were released last autumn. CMS actually decided to change things up and retain the 5 levels of coding for established patients, reduce the number of levels to 4 for new patients, so they're deleting that 99201, revise almost all the code definitions, only require history and exam for code selection as medically appropriate. They also revise the time and medical decision-making guideline for all codes, and they're going to allow clinicians to choose the visit level based on either medical decision-making or time. And something crucial this year as well, starting in 2021, time is going to be the total time personally spent by the reporting practitioner on the day of the visit. So that includes face-to-face time, but it also includes non-face-to-face time spent reporting or documenting. So you can see, based on the percentage increases, we're seeing some improvement here with payment, particularly for established patient office visits. Now, CMS has also finalized add-on codes, which can be used for longer and more complex patient visits. So reimbursement, including the add-on codes, is shown in the tables on your screen now. And it may appear at first glance that physicians will be earning an overall higher level of reimbursement, something to get excited about. However, this may not always be the case. So this table shows the estimated impact by specialty of these E&M coding changes. CMS has seen the biggest concern expressed about the impact of reevaluating those office or outpatient E&M visit code set, particularly for practitioners or providers who do not routinely bill those outpatient E&M visits. So because, again, Medicare law requires that CMS impose a budget neutrality adjustment if changes in RVUs are going to cause an increase or decrease in that overall fee schedule of more than 20 million, E&M code valuation changes could actually trigger a cut in other individual codes or in calendar year 2021 update to meet those budget neutrality rules. So as a result, what we're looking at are the projected winners and losers by specialty of who will see the biggest impact of these changes. So the noticeable losers, we'll call them, are actually ophthalmology with a possible negative 10% impact, radiology with negative 8%, and then also PT and OT with a negative 8%. Now, on the flip side, the winners, as designated by CMS with this impact, are specialties like allergy, family practice with a positive 12% possible impact, as well as general practice, pain management. NPs and PAs have around a positive 8% possible impact, rheumatology with a positive 15%, and even OBGYN with a positive 7%. Now, if you are squinting your eyes and using your finger to find your specialty on the screen right now to see what that projected impact will be on your practice, like I would be, number one, I hope I caught you, or at least one of you doing this, and now you're kind of looking over your shoulder like, how did she know? But number two, let me save you some time. We're sending out a copy of the slides, like Chelsea mentioned, that will have this chart in it, so don't be upset, but I'm going to advance to the next slide. So what this means from the final rule itself is that overall, specialties that bill higher level established patient visits, think of family practice, or the final rule said endocrinology, they will see the greatest increases as those codes were revalued higher relative to the rest of the office outpatient E&M code set. So those specialties that see the greatest decreases are those that do not generally bill office E&M visits. Other specialty level impacts are primarily driven by the extent to which those specialties bill using those E&M code set and the relative increases to the particular office E&M codes predominantly billed by those specialties. So what that means, the amount that a physician bills these office E&M codes will really have the biggest impact on their reimbursement. So what we need to keep in mind is that as the minimal changes to the physician fee schedule, and then of course the E&M coding overhaul show, increases to volume-based payments will not be sustainable. Practices need to understand this major change in order to stay afloat, because all medical reimbursement, not just from the government, is moving away from fee-for-service and toward value-based payment. The private sector truly is following suit with what the government has established for value-based care. And the value-based program that stands out the most is MIPS. Almost every physician, I would probably say now, is familiar with the MIPS program in some capacity. MIPS really is that first step to a value-based payment model under Macra. However, with the amount of clinicians who successfully participated in the first years of MIPS, the original expected incentive amounts are nowhere near the 4% and 5% positive adjustments that Medicare had once promised or predicted for us. So even clinicians who scored 100% on their MIPS performance earned under 2% in the first 2 performance years of the program, which is not enough to make up for the difference in inflation or lack of increase in the actual conversion factor for Medicare. So if a provider cannot earn a high incentive by participating in MIPS, what might their other options be? Well, as strange or backward as it may sound, continue to participate in MIPS. Truly, as the performance threshold to avoid a penalty increases year by year, there's a much higher chance that physicians who perform well will earn a higher incentive. Personally, with all MIPS clients that I'm working with this year and the changes that they've made in the requirements, it is a lot harder to earn a positive incentive this year. So I do imagine there'll be quote unquote more losers to fund higher incentive payments this year. You can also join an advanced alternative payment model or an APM. These are truly what Medicare and private payers envision as the future way of value-based payment. Basically, it's a payment approach that provides an additional lump sum payment of 5% for providing high quality, cost-efficient care. But I am a realist. I know these programs aren't the golden ticket or the final solution to this problem. We need additional ways to increase revenue in your practices. So some other ways to ensure a financially healthy practice and boost revenue that aren't directly tied to regulatory changes are things like extending your practice hours or even considering offering virtual visits, offering same-day appointments. We encourage you to use your NPs or PAs for these appointments as you need. Maximize your marketing. You want to utilize a patient survey to make improvements in your practice. You can also build or maintain an online presence to stay competitive. This was a huge topic at MGMA conference this year. We also did a webinar on this last month as well. It's becoming more and more important. Offer new and expanded services, so consider things like chronic care management. Maximize your staff. So what that means is ensure each employee is working at the top of their licensure skills and delegate work appropriately. So something an MA can do shouldn't be done by a nurse, and something a nurse can do shouldn't be done by a doctor, so on and so forth. Reduce missed appointments. So think about adding a cancellation fee or a virtual visit option if a patient cannot make it in. And then lastly, what we will be focusing on today is putting in place a process to recover bad debt, which can be a great way to increase potentially lost revenue. Now, the term bad debt usually refers to accounts receivable that will not be collected. In healthcare, this is the amount a patient or other payer cannot or will not pay of its portion of the bill. Essentially, it's the difference between what was billed to the patient and then the amount the patient paid. Patients really are finding it increasingly difficult to pay off their medical bill balances, and that's forcing more and more physician practices to actually chase after bad debt. We've heard of surprise medical bills a lot in the headlines and in Congress and possible legislation coming about this year. This is a big problem. And according to a report actually recently released from TSYS, about 68% of patients in 2016 failed to pay off medical bill balances. That's up from 53% in 2015 and 49% in 2014. They also found that 47% of Americans said they would be unable to pay for an unexpected medical bill of $100 or more without going into debt. As a result, more physician practices are dealing with bad patient debt on a regular basis. According to that same report, 22% of physician practices said that at least 10% of their patients have bad debt tied to them. In addition, 54% of practices said between 3 and 9% of their accounts actually go to bad debt. And this requires practices and healthcare organizations to go after that debt. And 56% of practices surveyed said the debt recovery would take 3 months or longer. This really is lost cash flow that could be used for new equipment, technology, education, office improvements, or other needed updates and improvements. And it also means wasted time trying to chase down debt. So hopefully this didn't bore you to sleep, but instead kind of grabbed your attention and framed up why this topic is so important. Because we can tell provider reimbursement is in danger, and it's a critical time in the industry to check the pulse on the financial health of your practice and make sure you're doing everything you can to increase your practice revenue, especially in ways that aren't linked to regulations that your practice has control over. One of those being bad debt. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lexi, who will explain how this problem can be improved through the NextGen bad debt process. So Lexi, it is yours whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. So as we just saw, reimbursement can be a big struggle for a lot of practices. So with more and more patients finding it harder to pay their medical bills, we need a solution to help your practice in recouping this potentially lost revenue. So the process, which we're here to talk about today, in NextGen is called the bad debt process. So in today's webinar, we're going to review how to pre-list encounters, move encounters to bad debt status, and then eventually run the bad debt process. So we're also going to discuss how encounters can be reinstated from bad debt if that's needed. And then finally, we'll take a look at how reporting is affected by using the bad debt process. So before we can even begin dealing with these unpaid encounters, there is some configuration that needs to be completed. This is going to ensure that the bad debt process functions best for your practice. So as you can imagine, the ability to place encounters in bad debt status and ultimately send them off to collections is something that should only be done by users who know what they're doing. So this is addressed, like any other permissions in NextGen, by limiting rights in System Administrator. So our rights for the bad debt process can be found under the operations group in System Admin. So first off, there are rights to pre-list encounters. So if this is enabled, this is going to give users the ability to actually pre-list those encounters that are then reviewed to potentially be moved to the bad debt. There are also rights to reinstate encounters. So with this right, users will be able to reinstate encounters, which is going to remove them from bad debt status. And then finally, there's a right that when it's enabled, will give users the ability to access the bad debt process. So this is the process that actually moves those encounters from Prelist and sends them to collections. So with all of those correct permissions in place, you'll now need to go into file maintenance. Here we're going to review some of the options at both the system and practice level. So one of the first pieces of configuration that must be done to utilize the bad debt process is to create at least one collection agency. So this is used when pre-listing encounters and basically just earmarks a particular encounter for a specified agency. So something to note, if your practice does in-house collections, then that collection agency can be internal. But you just want to make sure you don't skip this step because if you don't have any collection agency set up, then you won't be able to get past the first step in the process. And then while we just saw the setup of collection agency is required, there is some optional setup. So if your practice chooses to use task types, we can use those in our bad debt process. So in our task types system master file, tasks can be created at both the encounter and account levels. So these tasks are going to help you identify encounters for the bad debt process, and then you can actually even automate some of the steps so it'll happen automatically for you. So first, we're going to take a look at some of the encounter level tasks that can be turned on for your practice. So one task that's been created for an encounter, it can be look at any encounters that are greater than X days old from a specified date, and if the patient balance is between X dollars. So for example, let's say I wanted to create a task for all encounters that are 30 days old from the date of patient responsibility, and the patient balance is between $5 and that typical top threshold of $999,999. So this task can also be set up on the Auto Worker tab, and it will actually go ahead and pre-list all those encounters that meet that criteria. Another task can also be created to notify users when encounters are pre-listed. So a chart alert can be auto-created from this task as well, and then that would let users see when they open a particular chart if there's an encounter that is pre-listed. This task can also be configured to auto-complete, so if that encounter ever reaches history status or is actually moved to bad debt, that alert would be removed. Tasks can also be created to identify when encounters are moved to bad debt status. So this task would be particularly helpful if you automate any of these processes. And then at the encounter level, you can also create a task that notifies users when encounters are not receiving statements because the print statement indicator has been turned off. So you can specify the amount of days that it's been turned off. And if your practice is currently using this task, and then you do decide to implement the bad debt process, you have the ability to set this task to autocomplete when the encounter reaches bad debt status. So that's just going to help eliminate irrelevant tasks while the encounter is going through the bad debt process. So like we just saw at the encounter level, there are also several tasks available to set up at the account level. So we saw the ability to have the system pre-list encounters based on certain criteria on the previous slide. So you can complete that same process, but at the account level. So this time, this task is not only going to look at the balance of an individual patient, but actually it's going to look at the balance of the guarantor. So when this particular task type is set up for Auto Worker, all encounters on the account will be pre-listed. So at the account level, just something to note, that date criteria that is selected is going to look at the most current encounter under the account. So for example, if I choose last billed date. Another task, if your practice is using budget plans, you can set up a task to identify encounters that are on a budget plan and become pre-listed. So alerts can also be auto-created from this task that will display on the account. So that's going to be particularly helpful to let users know, when those budget plan payments are not being made, and then as a result, those encounters were pre-listed for bad debt. Something else to consider when setting up tasks and using the bad debt process is that at the account level, we have the ability to exclude encounters with the status of bad debt from any auto creations. So this feature is going to allow you to ensure that the system is not looking at encounters where that patient balance has already been designated for bad debt. So this is going to help cut down on unnecessary tasks, and it's going to save your staff some time having to review each one. So in addition to those various tasks that we just saw that can help with bad debt, there are also 2 transaction codes that are a vital part of this process. So these transaction codes are applied when running the bad debt process, and they're actually used to track money that is moved to the bad debt bucket. So these transaction codes are typically pre-built in the system during implementation. So in addition to all that system configuration that we just looked at, there are also several practice level items that need to be configured. So in order to send collection letters as part of the bad debt process, they must first be created in the letters master file. So these letters can be created for both the encounter and account level. And once created, these letters can be used during the pre-list process. So a lot of times they're used as, that final attempt to receive payment from the patient before having to actually send them to collections. Another aspect of the bad debt setup is the patient status of bad debt. So this is typically built into the system during implementation, but it can be customized to fit your practice needs. So this status actually has the ability to affect the functionality of an encounter. So for instance, it can be used to create a status alert on the patient's chart. So when that encounter is actually moved to bad debt. The status can also be configured to impact appointment scheduling. So you actually have two options in regards to scheduling. So the first is to create a conflict. So this will actually alert a user if they are trying to schedule an appointment for the patient. But just as a note, this can be overridden if the user has the appropriate rights. The second option is to actually prevent scheduling. So this is going to stop users from scheduling appointments for the patient as long as they have an encounter in bad debt. And even if the user has rights to override conflicts, they cannot override this one. It's important to note that in order to use these patient statuses, that this functionality does need to be enabled in practice preferences. So if your practice hasn't already done so, you'd want to go to practice preferences on the chart tab, and there's a checkbox to enable patient status. So in addition to that patient status of bad debt that we just reviewed, there are also statuses that are created in the bad debt statuses master list. So not to get these two features confused, these bad debt statuses are used for reporting functionality only. So the statuses are assigned to Prelisted Encounters, and we're going to talk about their use on a later slide. So once your practice has completed the master file and the master list configuration, it's important to review the options that you have under practice preferences. So most of those preferences related to bad debt are going to be found under our Transactions tab. So the first preference we're going to go over is to prevent bad debt encounters from going to history status. So when this preference is checked, once a bad debt encounter reaches a $0 balance, it will go to bad debt history status instead of our regular history status. So why would we want a separate status? Well, for one, visually, this is going to separate the status and we'll see it on the patient's chart. So instead of that red $ icon next to the encounter, instead will change to a green $. So it's going to be helpful in tracking encounters that were previously in bad debt. So just as a note, once this preference is enabled, it is not going to retroactively go back and move your history encounters to bad debt history. It will have, however, if it's checked for the practice and then it's unchecked at some point in the future, it is going to go back and all bad debt encounters are going to move to regular history status. The next preference we're going to take a look at is the ability to default bad debt transaction codes for specific payers. So this information pulls directly from the payer master file if you would like specific transaction codes based on payer. And then the last bad debt practice that we'll look at is the option to show bad debt charges at the account level. So when you have this preference enabled, bad debt charges will show in the payment entry window when a source type of account is used. So these charges will be designated with that red $, that's our bad debt icon. So the last step in the configuration of the bad debt process is actually optional. So if your practice does use the background business processor or BBP, you do actually have the ability to automate several steps of the bad debt process, and that's just going to reduce some of the manual work required. So the first job is the bad debt process. So this is going to mirror the functionality of manually running pre-listed encounters through the bad debt process. So you would configure things like collection agencies, the effective date, time frame. And then later on, we're going to discuss how to view reports of the encounters that were placed in bad debt. So you can see the ones that were placed by the BBP. The next two BBP jobs allow you to automate the creation of batch collection letters. So these letters, as we mentioned previously, can be created from the account and encounter levels. So those the accounts for which letters should be created are marked on the General tab of the account profile. And then the encounters that collection letters should be created for are marked on the Billing and Collections tab of the encounter from the patient's chart. And we'll take a look at what that looks like a little bit later. Okay, so once all that configuration has been completed, your practice can begin with the first step, which is to pre-list encounters. So this pre-listing process is actually going to allow users to earmark encounters for bad debt, but it also allows the practice to have oversight before they're actually sent to collections. So as I mentioned previously, this is a separate right. So you have the ability in your practice to allow users to pre-list encounters, but then you can limit the users that can actually send those encounters to bad debt. So encounters can be pre-listed from two different places in NextGen, so the account profile and the patient chart. So it's also important to note that there are certain requirements an encounter must meet in order to be pre-listed. So an encounter must have a status of billed, the patient balance must be greater than 0, the encounter cannot have a credit balance, and there can be no unposted transactions. So all these requirements are just kind of put in place to ensure that the correct encounters are being considered for bad debt status. So if a user would like to pre-list encounters, so for several patients for a guarantor at one time, this is accomplished from the account profile. So to pre-list encounters from an account, the user would go to the Encounter Details tab of the account profile. They would right-click on the patient name, and then from the menu, they would choose Prelist and then Open. So a user does have the ability from this window to select multiple encounters, and that's going to be for all patients under the guarantor. So on this screen, there are a few required fields, and those are collection agency and effective date. So these fields are going to be used for sorting encounters in the next step, which is running the bad debt process. There are also two optional fields on this screen. So for our guarantor credit rating and our bad debt status. So these fields are solely informational and they're used for reporting. That bad debt status, so we mentioned briefly, that's often used for like instructions to collection agencies, for examples, to send letters only, or it can be used internally to track why an encounter is pre-listed. So for instance, you can have a bad debt status of failure to honor a payment plan. If a user only needs to pre-list encounters for a single patient, this can be done from the patient chart. So this process is going to be very similar to pre-listing from the account profile. But this time the user would open the patient's chart and they would go to that Encounters tab. From there, they would right-click on the encounter to be pre-listed. And from the menu, they would select Prelist and then Open. So if multiple encounters for a single patient do need to be pre-listed, you can select them all from this one window. And then like we saw at the account level, there are two required fields for the collection agency and the effective date. And then there are also two optional fields for the guarantor credit rating and bad debt status. So as part of your practice's attempt to recoup payment from patients before you actually send them to collections, you may use a final collection letter. These letters, as we discussed earlier, are created in the letters master file. And then once created, these letters are assigned at either the account or the encounter level. So to assign a collection letter at the account level, a user would open the account profile and then go to the collection sections of the General tab. And then if they wanted to assign a letter at the encounter level, they would go to the patient's chart, click on that Encounters tab, and from there you would open the appropriate encounter, and then you could select a letter from the Billing and Collections tab. Once these are assigned, these letters can be printed in a batch, and that can happen either from the print form menu in PM or through the BBP, so that's just kind of depending on your practice's setup. So it's important before continuing to process your encounters for bad debt that you stop and review your pre-listed encounters. So depending on the setup of the security rights in your practice, those pre-listed encounters can come from a whole host of users. So it's important to have oversight as to which encounters actually continue on to be placed in bad debt status. So those pre-listed encounters can be reviewed from what's called the Encounters Pending Bad Debt Status Report. So just as a note, to generate this report, a user does have to have the security rights that allow them to run the bad debt process. So as long as you have the proper access, a user can go to the File menu in PM and select Processes and then Bad Debt. The report can be filtered, as you can see in this window, by either a single collection agency or you can actually select multiple, and then you would choose your effective date. Once you've selected your filter criteria, you would click Preview, and that's going to generate a report of all of the pre-listed encounters in that criteria. And then in the report, if any additional digging is needed, a user can actually double-click on any specific encounter, and they can view the patient chart. Just as a note, NextGen does recommend that a snapshot of this report is created, and that can just be helpful to use as reference if it's needed after the encounters are processed. So as I mentioned before, pre-listed encounters, you can kind of think of that as a way to earmark these encounters for collections. So it is possible that an encounter could have either been erroneously pre-listed or what we all hope for, that the past due amount is paid before a collection agency has to be involved. So in those scenarios, encounters can actually be removed from pre-list. So this can be done for an individual patient from the patient chart or for all patients underneath the guarantor at the account level. So to remove an encounter or even multiple encounters from pre-list, you would go to either the patient chart or the account profile, and then you click on the Encounters tab. You would right-click on either the patient name or the encounter. You'd select Pre-list from the menu and then click Delete. So as you can see here from this Delete Pre-list window, the user has the option to select all encounters that need to be removed from pre-list. So once a practice pre-lists their past due encounters, they've gone through, they've reviewed that list, the next step would be to actually move those encounters to the bad debt status. So this is actually going to place those encounters in a separate bad debt AR bucket, and it's going to allow the list of encounters to be moved to a collection agency. So that same encounters pending bad debt status report that we saw used previously to review pre-listed encounters is also the report that's used to generate a list of the encounters to pass along to the collection agencies. So again, this report is generated by going to the File menu in PM. You would select Processes and then Bad Debt. So this time we're going to filter our report by whatever specific collection agency you're creating it for and that effective date. So once those filters have been selected, you click that Preview button to generate your report. You do have the ability, like with any report in PM, to either filter that list more or even change some of the formatting, just depending on what the collection agency needs to see. And it is recommended that once you've done that, you click the Memorize Report icon, so our little floppy disk, to save those changes. And those changes will actually save, and then the next time you go to run the bad debt process, you will still have all of your formatting so you don't have to repeat it. So once that report is formatted correctly, you can then either print it, export it to Excel, and then you can pass that along to the appropriate collection agency. So now that the report for the collection agency has been generated, it's time to actually process those encounters. So if you still do have the report open, once you go to click out of that report to close it, you will be prompted to process the encounters. If you had hit no and you close the report without processing, or the report wasn't run in the first place, you can still process the report. or processing encounters, excuse me. So from that bad debt processing window, instead of clicking preview, you would click OK, and then that's going to move those encounters to bad debt status. So there are several changes that actually happen to an encounter when it's put in bad debt status. So first, 2 transaction codes are applied to the encounter. So that's that Z bad debt credit and Z bad debt debit. Try saying that one 5 times fast. So these transaction codes are actually used for reporting a bad debt, and they're going to move those outstanding balances to a separate bad debt accounts receivable bucket. So it doesn't actually remove the money from AR, but it just designates it for reporting purposes, so you can easily see what amount you can expect to collect through your normal processes and what amount has been sent to collections. Our encounter status is also changed to bad debt. So this is indicated by that red $ icon. And that's just going to help you visually see in places like the patient chart which encounters are in bad debt. An encounter note is also added to the chart. So that note that says agency bad debt write-off will show who actually processed the encounter and when that encounter moved to bad debt. An account alert is also created that reads account bad debt, and this will be added to the account if it has any bad debt encounters. So once those encounters have been processed and moved to bad debt, the status change is not actually set in stone. An encounter can be reinstated. So much like removing an encounter from Prelist, an encounter could be reinstated for a few reasons. So maybe it was processed in error, or it could be reinstated, for the reason that we're using this whole process in the first place, a payment was made. So if an encounter is reinstated, it's going to return to billed status, and that's going to allow the user to post a payment if one has been received, or continue to work with the encounter. So as you can imagine, a user does have to have the appropriate security rights to reinstate encounter. So just like the ability to process encounters in the first place, the ability to restate those encounters should be limited to just the right people. Encounters can be reinstated from both the account profile and the patient chart. And just like we saw with our pre-listed encounter, there are a few requirements to be able to reinstate an encounter. It sounds obvious, but we're stating, number 1, the encounter must have a status of bad debt. The patient balance must also be greater than or equal to 0. All insurance balances must be 0. The encounter cannot have a credit balance, and there can be no unposted transactions. So if encounters from multiple patients under a guarantor need to be reinstated, your best bet is to use the account profile. So from that Encounter Details tab, you can right-click on the patient name and select Reinstate. That Reinstate window is going to allow you to select all encounters that are currently in bad debt that need to be reinstated. So the process is very similar from the patient chart. So from our Encounters tab, we select our encounter. We can right-click and select Reinstate from the menu. If the patient has multiple encounters that need to be reinstated, it can be done from this one window. So when an encounter is reinstated, what does that look like? So the same system transaction codes that were used to place that encounter in bad debt in the first place are applied again. So this time it's going to do the reverse. So it's going to move those patient balances back to our regular AR bucket. Our encounter status will change back from the red $ to the medical building icon. So that represents our build status. And yes, according to NextGen, the build icon is supposed to be a medical building. Learn something new. An encounter note will also be added to the chart. So this is going to show who reinstated the encounter and when. And the account alert for account bad debt that we saw added during the bad debt process is going to be removed from the account. So it's important to note that this alert will only be removed if all bad debt encounters for an account have been reinstated. So now that we've taken a look at what the process looks like from taking an encounter from being unpaid all the way to collections, how do we keep track of the encounters throughout the process? So, well, you always have the option of manually checking each account or each chart. There are several reports, and that will help you to keep tabs on the encounter going through the bad debt process. So one of the important aspects of sending an encounter through the bad debt process is the ability to move that outstanding balance to a separate AR bucket. So this is just for bad debt. So this is really going to help allow your practice to more accurately understand where your money stands. So our account receivable reports that your practice is most likely already using today will actually separate the bad debt balances, and that happens because of the transaction codes that are added. So this is typically represented by separate columns for bad debt. So you can see in this example, like in our account summary report. There are also several reports that allow for filtering encounters by removing the bad debt status. Another reporting functionality that's beneficial to keep track of bad debt encounters is a report to show all encounters that are either in the process or they've already moved to bad debt status. So this is accomplished by making some tweaks to our daily encounters report. So first, under our Filter 1 tab, you would want to uncheck all encounter statuses except for bad debt. If you're only interested in encounters for a specified date range, then that range can be entered on the Filter 1 tab as well. On the Columns tab, there are several bad debt specific columns that can be selected, and it's just going to kind of depend on what information you want to see. So you can see information such as, if there's a pre-list indicator for an encounter, the effective date for pre-list, what collection agency was assigned, the bad debt date, and then if applicable, the reinstated date. So as you can see, this report can be really customized to what your practice finds valuable. And then the last report we're going to talk about is our collections follow-up report. So it's important to be able to keep tabs on the collections process. Once those encounters are processed to bad debt and turned over to collection agency, as good as we hope that agency is, it will take some time to recoup those funds. So to help with tracking that process of following up with the collection agencies, we can use this report that's built into NextGen. So this report is found under our accounts receivable category, and this collections follow-up report is based on the follow-up date field. This is found on our encounter maintenance window. So this field, used in conjunction with this report, can kind of serve as a reminder for when the collection agency was last contacted. So once the report is run and the collection agencies have been followed up with, we can actually use this report to update if any additional follow-up is needed. So to do that, a user would double-click on a patient's name, and that would open their chart. And then from the Encounters tab, you would open the encounter and go to that Billing and Collections tab. They could update that follow-up field that we've highlighted here to a future date. And then once that field has been updated to a future date, that encounter will be crossed off the report, and then the user can continue down the list until all encounters needed following up are addressed. So this report can be really helpful, to kind of help close the loop on the bad debt process.
Perfect. Thanks, Lexi. So I think where we stand today, we're going to leave you with this question to reflect on here. How do you feel about the financial health of your practice and using bad debt to recoup patient payments? We hope after this webinar, you are as zen as the provider on the screen and feeling confident you know why you need to worry about bad debt and kind of this ever-changing industry and understand the process from start to finish in NextGen. However, we know that may be as realistic as having a provider meditating in the sand in their scrubs. So if you are feeling overwhelmed, because that was a ton of information, let's look at next steps and how iTenif can help you. We can assess your current situation or standing and provide recommendations and help implement new processes and procedures surrounding bad debt and also other value-based care models as well, such as MIPS. For next steps, feel free to visit our website. Continue to sign up for our webinars. We have a lot of great content coming out. Consider some of the services we offer as well. We do offer Macra assistance with MIPS reporting and APM reporting. We also have 3-day fixed price on-site consultations for EHR, which is clinical workflow, PM, which includes revenue cycle, which would include the bad debt process, as well as test drive our products such as ChartGuard and Refund Manager. And of course, you can always reach out to us directly, but it looks like we have made it to questions. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Chelsea for any questions those of you on the call may have.
Great, thank you so much, Lindsay, and thank you, Lexi, and thanks for everyone again for joining us. If you have questions, again, you can type them in the questions area of the webinar control panel. We only have a couple, so we should be able to get to them all. So feel free to type them and we'll just answer them in the order that we've received them. So the first question, do we have to use a collection agency or can we have in-house collections? Lexi?
So no, you do not have to use a collection agency. You can definitely, if you do this in-house, pretty much the whole process would be the same. The difference would be that collection agency, you still need to have one in place in the master file. You could just name it like internal. And then instead of generating that report to send out, you could just send it, internally or have it accessed internally by your own collection agency.
Great, thank you. Next question. If I process the bad debt, can I remove the encounters?
I think is the question asking if you can delete the encounters, and you would typically not be able to delete the encounters because once they have, at that point they have charges, transaction, things like that. But if your question was once you, process them, are you able to remove them from bad debt status? You definitely can. So that's reinstating those encounters. So hopefully that answered your question.
And if it didn't, feel free to reach out to, you see Lexi's email address up on the screen, feel free to reach out to her directly. And it looks like this might be our last question, but we'll hang on for questions in case there's more as well. NextGen AR reports ignore the date filters in PM. Have people resolved this issue? Custom reports?
I have not really heard of any resolutions for that. If you are struggling with a particular report and it's not really filtering how you think it should, again, like Chelsea just said, you can feel free to reach out to me and I can help you take a look and see if maybe, there's different filters you could try. Yeah, so just feel free to reach out if you're struggling with a particular report.
Okay, well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have. Again, keep your eyes out for an email from us next month for an exciting new webinar that should be another NextGen specific popular one. Otherwise, I hope that everybody has a really wonderful Thanksgiving, and thank you everybody for joining us this week, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.